May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So I remember one of the first sermons that I ever preached. And it was during my first semester in seminary, and I received an invitation from my home parish to preach, the church in which I grew up. My immediate response was to panic. I'd preached one sermon before somewhere else, and I didn't feel like it had gone well. So when I received that invitation, I was still remembering that trauma from the previous sermon. And ever since then, I've been hoping that somebody at seminary would show me the right way to preach before I had to do it again. But here I was with that invite. They'd been kind to me. They'd even given me a scholarship towards my studies, and so I was pretty locked into giving that sermon. So about a week out, I began to prepare. The gospel was the Transfiguration. And so I grabbed everything that I could find from the seminary library: commentaries, library books, preaching resources, journals. Have you ever overloaded yourself with information? That's where I was, lost in the weeds. And as the date got closer, I began to catastrophize. Maybe I would crash and burn in epic fashion in front of the people I'd known my entire life. So the whole scene was pretty ugly. And when I did finally settle on a direction to take with the sermon, I wasn't exactly bubbling with confidence about the route I was going to take. Well, the big morning came, and I showed up to the church, and all of the same people from my childhood were there. And they said well-meaning things like, "We're so excited to hear you preach," or "I remember when you were 7 years old," just what you want to hear. "I can't believe how far you've come. It just seems like the other day you were in Sunday school." But with all my insecurity, those were exactly the words I didn't want to hear. It didn't add to my sense of authority in the pulpit. I was a novice, and this was going to be one big exercise in faking it. So as we began that first part of the service, it seemed to go by in record time. And before I knew it, I was up in the pulpit giving the sermon. Well, the good news was that lightning didn't strike me, and the walls of the church are still standing after that sermon was done. And after the service, one of the priests came up to me and offered a compliment. "I liked that sermon. I've never heard that angle on the Transfiguration before." And he was offering me a genuine compliment, just like those parishioners who remembered me as a child. But that compliment brought up all of the preparation in which I had been so anxious and struggled about what to preach on. And again, my brain went to catastrophe. I mean, maybe the priest didn't know that angle because subconsciously I had made it up. Or what if I just preached some sort of heresy? And it wasn't really until years later that I could look back on that sermon and realize that I actually did a pretty good job. So for me, the real learning about that experience was about the power of expectation. My own expectations and the congregation's expectations of me. Because when I walked into that church, I was immediately a little child again, and that affected me. And as a fresh seminary student, I was still learning how to have authority when I preached. And having that in that community was especially hard. Isn't it amazing how old expectations can emotionally take us back to a different place? So that whole experience came to mind for me when I read today's gospel. Jesus, God in human form, is teaching an audience about his identity. And the first thing that the listeners comment on is that this is Joseph's son. They know his grandparents. It kind of reminds me of my sermon experience. And I've always pondered this exchange as having maybe almost a Monty Python quality to it. sort of a comedy. And Jesus stands up there uttering official and pastoral words about his identity. And the audience just looks at each other and gossips and says, "Isn't that Mary and Joseph's boy? Who does he think he is?" That seems like a nice way to think about this passage. Gossip, or whispers, or projections of a child. But there's more going on today, because the crowd's response is connected to what Jesus is saying, as much as who he is. It's significant for us that this crowd is stuck in their view of Jesus as Joseph's son. Because who could be more constrained by their expectations of Jesus